On the morning of June 12, 1962, guards at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary began their routine count of the prison's most dangerous inmates. The island sat in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by strong currents and frigid tides. For decades, Alcatraz had been known as the prison that could not be escaped. The distance to shore was short on a map, but the waters between the island and the city were unpredictable, icy, and often deadly. Inside the cell house, rows of steel bars lined the long corridors. The routine was strict and predictable. Every movement of every inmate was documented. But that morning, something was wrong. In cell block B, guards noticed what appeared to be a man still asleep in his bunk. His head rested on the pillow, partially covered by a blanket. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then a guard tapped the bars with his baton. The head rolled off the pillow and fell to the floor. It was not a man. It was a carefully crafted dummy made from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair collected from the prison barber shop. Within minutes, officers discovered that 3 inmates were missing: Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. No alarms had sounded during the night. No guards had reported unusual activity, yet the men had vanished from the most secure prison, Dard. What followed would become one of the most famous escape mysteries Dar history, a story that still raises the same question more than 60 years later. Did they drown in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay? Or did the impossible actually happen? To understand how 3 men could disappear from Alcatraz, we have to begin long before the night of their escape, with the prison itself. Long before the events of June 1962, Alcatraz had already built a reputation unlike any other prison in the United States. Located on a small, rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, the facility had originally served as a military fort and later as a military prison. But in 1934, during a period when organized crime and prison violence were growing concerns across the country, the federal government converted Alcatraz into a maximum security penitentiary. Its purpose was simple: to house the most difficult and dangerous inmates in the federal system. Men who had proven impossible to manage in other prisons were sent there. Among its inmates were notorious criminals whose names had become part of American history, including Al Capone, George "Machine Gun" Kelly, and Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. Life on the island was deliberately strict. The prison operated under a system designed to remove nearly every opportunity for escape. Cells were small, routines were rigid, and movement was carefully monitored. Guards were trained to expect manipulation, deception, and patience from inmates who had little left to lose. But the greatest barrier was not the walls, it was the water. The currents in San Francisco Bay were powerful and unpredictable. Temperatures were often cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. Strong tides pushed swimmers toward the open Pacific. For decades, these natural defenses reinforced the belief that escape from Alcatraz was impossible. Yet within the prison walls, some inmates were quietly studying the very system designed to contain them. Among them were 3 men who would soon test the limits of what everyone believed could never be done. Among the inmates transferred to Alcatraz in the late 1950s was a man named Frank Morris. Morris had spent much of his life moving through the American prison system. Records described him as intelligent, disciplined, and unusually patient, qualities that often made him difficult for prison authorities to manage. He had already attempted several escapes from other institutions before arriving on the island. At Alcatraz, Morris was assigned to a cell in Block B. Not long after, 2 brothers from Georgia were placed in nearby cells. John Anglin and Clarence Anglin had grown up working farms along the southeastern coast of the United States. From a young age, they had become strong swimmers, often spending long hours in rivers and lakes near their home. As adults, they became involved in a series of bank robberies that eventually led to their arrest and imprisonment. Inside Alcatraz, the three men began to form a quiet alliance. Life inside the prison followed an unchanging routine: early morning counts, work assignments, meals, and strict nightly lockdowns. But routines also created predictability, and predictability could be studied. Over time, Morris and the Anglin brothers began observing the physical structure of their cells. Behind each cell was a narrow utility corridor used for ventilation and maintenance. The walls separating the cells from this hidden space were made of aging concrete that had slowly deteriorated after years of exposure to salt air from the bay. To most prisoners, it was just another wall. To Morris and the Anglins, it looked like an opportunity. And slowly, over the course of months, they began to test whether that wall might be weaker than it appeared. What began as quiet observation soon turned into a careful and methodical operation. Inside their cells, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers began working on the ventilation openings located beneath the sinks. Using improvised tools, including spoons taken from the prison dining hall and a makeshift drill assembled from parts of a stolen vacuum cleaner motor, they slowly chipped away at the weakened concrete around the vents. The work had to be done carefully and patiently. Each night after the evening count, the men spent hours widening the openings just enough to pass through. To avoid detection during inspections, they covered the holes with carefully painted cardboard panels designed to resemble the surrounding wall. But creating an escape route through the wall was only the first challenge. Beyond the cells was a narrow service corridor that led upward to the roof of the cell house. From there, the men would still need a way to reach the water and somehow survive the journey across the bay. Inside the hidden corridor, the group began building something else. Using more than 50 raincoats stolen from the prison laundry, they assembled a makeshift raft and life vests. The rubber material was stitched together and sealed with heat from steam pipes in the corridor, forming a crude but potentially buoyant craft. At the same time, another detail of the plan began taking shape inside their cells. If the guards looked in during the night, someone still had to appear to be sleeping in the bunks. And so the men began crafting the objects that would become the most famous detail of the escape: 3 lifelike heads. Made from soap, paper, and real human hair. On the night of June 11th, 1962, the plan finally moved from preparation to action. Inside cell block B, the prison routine unfolded exactly as it had on countless nights before. Guards conducted the evening count, lights dimmed, doors remained locked behind rows of steel bars as the cell house settled into silence. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Behind the walls of several cells, however, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers quietly began the final stage of their escape. After the last count, each man carefully positioned the dummy head in his bed. Blankets were arranged to create the appearance of a sleeping body beneath the covers, a detail meant to withstand the brief flashlight inspections guards occasionally made during the night. Then the men slipped through the widened ventilation openings beneath their sinks and entered the narrow service corridor behind the cell block. There, hidden from view, they climbed up a network of pipes and utility structures leading toward the roof of the prison building. Once outside, the group carried their improvised raft and life vests down the far side of the structure toward the shoreline of the island. Shortly before midnight, they reached the water's edge. Somewhere in the darkness of San Francisco Bay, the men inflated their raft and pushed away from Alcatraz Island. What happened next remains uncertain. No guard saw them leave, no alarm was triggered during the night. By morning, the raft and the 3 men had vanished into the cold currents of the bay, leaving behind only the silent prison cells that had hidden their escape. And when the guards began their routine count the next day, the discovery would shock the entire country. When guards discovered the empty cells on the morning of June 12, 1962, Alcatraz immediately went into lockdown. Searchlights swept across the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, while boats and helicopters began combing the surrounding area. The United States Coast Guard joined the search, scanning the currents and nearby shoreline for any sign of the 3 missing men. Within hours, the story spread far beyond the island. Newspapers across the country reported that 3 inmates had disappeared from the most secure prison in the United States. For many Americans, the idea that someone might have escaped from Alcatraz seemed almost impossible. In the days that followed, investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation reconstructed the events of the escape. Inside the cell house, they discovered the widened ventilation openings behind the sinks, the hidden service corridor, and the tools used to carve through the concrete. On the roof, evidence showed how the men had climbed out of the building. Along the water near Angel Island, search teams later recovered fragments of the improvised raft and a life vest believed to be connected to the escape. Despite extensive searches, however, no bodies were ever found. For years afterward, the FBI maintained that the men likely drowned in the powerful currents of the bay. Yet the lack of definitive evidence left the case open to ongoing speculation. In 1979, the official federal investigation was closed. But the question that began on that June morning in 1962 never fully disappeared. What truly happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers once they left the island? Today, Alcatraz Island stands as one of the most recognizable landmarks in San Francisco Bay. What was once a maximum security federal prison is now part of a national park, visited by millions of people each year. Tour boats arrive daily, carrying visitors who walk the same corridors once occupied by some of the most famous inmates in American history. Inside Cell Block B, the cells once assigned to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers remain preserved. The narrow bars, the small concrete walls, and the ventilation openings beneath the sinks still tell the quiet story of what happened there in June of 1962. More than 60 years later, the escape from Alcatraz continues to occupy a unique place in American history, not because of violence or spectacle, but because of the enduring mystery it left behind. No confirmed evidence has ever revealed whether the 3 men survived their journey across the bay. What remains is a question that still lingers in the shadow of the island's concrete walls. Sometimes, history is remembered through clear answers, but sometimes it is remembered through the questions that remain. If you enjoy exploring these lesser-known stories from American history, consider subscribing to Unseen America, where we uncover the quiet mysteries that helped shape the country, one story at a time.